All right, continuing on page 492. So why Hawaii for the Mauna Loa graph? Well, Mr. Keeling wanted to find a place that was not near the continents, so he picked Hawaii because it's still the U.S. and he could set it up an observatory there. But he didn't want it influenced by the continents because continents have a lot of vegetation. He also put it on like a dormant volcano that was not spewing out any gases, and it was rocky because he didn't want plant matter nearby. So he chose it again to be away from the continents and no vegetation nearby, so he put it on kind of a rocky volcano that was a dormant volcano. And it's been measuring CO2 since 1958, and this is our main observatory telling us how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, and it's gone up dramatically even since 1958, so we're still burning more and more fossil fuels. And so there's a zigzag pattern, and you need to know why there is a zigzag pattern up here. So you can see that this blue line shows that the carbon dioxide levels go up and down, up and down, up and down. And this is summer, winter, summer, winter, summer, winter. And then this red line is the line of best fit. So why? So the bottom of the zigzag pattern shows the summer in the northern hemisphere. The northern hemisphere has the most land mass and therefore has the most trees. And during the summer, all of these trees have leaves and they remove CO2 from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. However, a lot of those trees are deciduous and they lose their leaves in the winter, and so you have less photosynthesis, which means more CO2 is still in the atmosphere because trees are not taking it in. So the top of the pattern of the zigzag is the winter, which means more CO2 in the atmosphere. And so you do have to know this for your exam, why the zigzag pattern, and specifically northern hemisphere, leaves on the trees, blah, blah, blah. Whatever we wrote, you have to know. Okay, so the IPCC here, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, meets every few years, every couple of years, and sort of updates what's going on with climate change. So know their role. All right, so some of the trends that we've seen regarding climate change, we have surface temperatures have increased, glaciers and snowmelts have melted, sea level has risen, and then ocean water has become more acidic. We have these indicators, and we can see these here in California, in Santa Clarita. Our summers have gotten hotter and hotter and hotter. When I grew up in Santa Clarita, our hottest days were like 102. Now our hottest days are like 112 during the summer. And so even in Santa Clarita, we have seen a difference. So know 2 to 4 of these indicators. What evidence do we have that the Earth has gotten hotter? And then we just have straight old temperature here, showing that the hottest years on records have been the last few years. And you can see that as well here. All right, so turn the page. So know this figure and caption on change in temperature. So we've risen more degrees here on average. In California, we have risen 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit for our average temperatures. Some places have gotten cooler. So most of it, though, has warmed. All right. And so the next couple pages talk about some of our predictions that the jet stream may change, which may change to different weather patterns. All right, so glaciers are melting, and we have huge amounts of evidence now. People have been taking lots of pictures showing glaciers retreating every single year for the past 10 years. And here's some evidence from the Jackson Glacier as it has retreated and melted. And so this area is actually going to go through primary succession here. All right, so what's going to happen with melting glaciers and melting ice? So melting glaciers and ice will decrease something called albedo, which is a reflection. So actually ice reflects back heat back into outer space or the atmosphere. And so if there's no ice, we're going to decrease reflection. And again, albedo is reflection. And so this creates a positive feedback loop. So when you have less albedo, then less reflection, which means more heat's absorbed into the earth, which is going to increase the temperature, which is then going to melt more ice, which will then decrease albedo, which will mean more heat absorbed, which means more temperature, which will melt more ice. So you can see it's a positive feedback loop. So permafrost is permanently frozen ground. And in the tundra, people who live up there, and there's not very many who live up there, but people who live up there build their homes on stilts because they can't build a foundation into frozen ground. So what's happened is that the ground up in the tundra is melting during the summer, but that frozen ground has a lot of trapped methane. And so when it melts, we are also releasing more methane, which then warms the climate more, which then melts more permafrost, which releases more methane, which then warms the climate more. And so that's also a positive feedback loop as well. Going on to 499. So sea levels are going to rise because first, the thermal expansion of water, and second, because of the melting of glacier ice. This is where students often, actually it's not just students, it's like almost everybody who doesn't study science. So people say, oh, sea levels are going to rise because of all the ice and glaciers and that are going to melt. Yes, but not most of it. Most of the sea level is going to rise, and you can see it up here. 57% of the sea level rise is caused from thermal expansion. Remember, warmer liquids take up more room. They will expand. And then some of it is from glaciers and ice, and then the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. So what do higher sea levels do? Well, they're going to bring salt into our aquifers, contaminating fresh water wells, as well as, flooding homes and causing damage and all of that. And so it makes hurricanes worse, actually, because the sea level's higher, and then the storm surges are higher. And so we had a big old hurricane called Hurricane Sandy on the East Coast a couple of years ago. And this one hasn't been on an FRQ yet, but it very well could be soon. And this caused huge, enormous amounts of damage. And they think that the damage was higher, again, because of the global warming. So go ahead and go on to page 501. So another consequence of global warming is that animal populations are shifting. So if you're a cold weather species, you're going to, if you can fly, you're going to move north to where you like it to be, because this is where it used to be cold enough for you. Now you got to move here because it's there. Other animals are going further up mountains because they like it colder. And so they'll move higher in elevation to get that cold. All right, so what about forests? So this is page 502. So plants act as sinks for carbon because they turn carbon dioxide into tissues. Students get this wrong a lot. Students think that plants through photosynthesis take in CO2 and turn CO2 into oxygen. No, photosynthesis takes in CO2, but the CO2 does not turn into oxygen. The oxygen comes from water. CO2 actually builds plant tissues. So plants take in CO2 and build their bodies from the CO2. So with more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, actually at first our forests are going to become more productive. So young forests actually, because they're still growing, will actually remove more carbon for photosynthesis. And so you'll hear a lot of people say, well, actually more CO2 is really good for the forests. Well, it is initially, but then what happens is that once the trees become mature, then they're not going to take in that CO2 as much. They still take in some. But then also we may not have the rainfall to keep that forest to survive, and it may dry out. So initially, yes, they're going to we'll get more young forest and more tree productivity. So there are effects of climate change to agriculture. So make sure you know in this paragraph 2 to 3 effects for agriculture. There is some concern that agriculture may shift north. So Canada may be growing more of our food than Texas. Forestry. So again, we may get more trees at first, but then we're also going to have more dry and hot conditions, which may create catastrophic fires in our forests. Health concerns. So health, I have a little star next to, because the AP test very often on an FRQ will ask you about health effects of climate change. And so we have more respiratory problems from air pollution because hotter temperatures promote photochemical smog. Expansion of tropical diseases, this is one we're worried about a lot because mosquitoes like warm temperatures, and if they don't get a big old freeze during the winter to kill off a lot of them, then they're going to be higher in number and spreading malaria, West Nile virus, and the new one, Zika virus. And then you can have drowning from storms, you can have heat stroke from hotter weathers, those are kinds of things. Okay, so are there possible benefits to climate change? Yeah, so there are a couple of benefits to climate change. So initially, because there's more CO2, we'll have more productivity in our forests that we just talked about. Some colder countries are actually not particularly upset because, you know, if you live in Norway and you have climate change, you're going to be able to grow more crops during the summer and make more money and grow more food. All right, turn to page 507. So some terms on here that you need to know. Mitigation means to kind of fix the problem. And so how do we fix climate change? Renewable energy sources, prevent deforestation, recovering landfill gas, etc. How do we adapt to it? So not just know the definitions, but know the explanations. So do we try and fix climate change, or at this point do we try to just adapt to it? Do we move people away in Florida from places that are going to be flooded or the Maldives? And then also know Energy Star, appliances are ways to reduce energy use, which causes most of our greenhouse gases. So electricity here produces most of our greenhouse gases, and that is because most electricity is in the world, and including the United States, is produced from burning coal, and coal produces huge amounts of CO2. In California, we don't burn coal, but we burn natural gas, which also produces CO2. Not as much, it's the best of the fossil fuels, but it still does produce CO2. So some other ways to reduce greenhouse gases: choose solar, wind, and hydroelectric electricity instead of burning fossil fuels. Buy a hybrid or an electric car. Use public transportation. Conserve your electricity with your appliance purchases and your energy efficient light bulbs. Ride a bike and reduce your meat because, again, producing meat produces a lot of methane. Know this figure, which means that our cars, as they currently are very energy inefficient, and the internal combustion engine, only 14% of the gas that you put in actually moves the car forward. The rest is, well, some of it's for other things, but a lot of it's lost as heat.